Hello, this is Mr. Brooks, and welcome to Lesson 1-6, Measuring Angles. In this lesson, we're going to find the measure of angles, and we're going to identify special angle pairs. First, we need to know how to name an angle. There are several different ways to name this angle. We could call this angle A, B, C, or we could call it angle C, B, A, or we could call this angle B, or we could name this angle angle 2. When you are naming an angle with 3 letters, you must make sure the vertex, which is where the 2 rays meet, the vertex is the middle letter of the 3. We could not call this angle BAC. However, you can only name an angle by its vertex if it's the only angle at that vertex. In other words, we cannot call any angle in this figure angle G because people will not know if you're talking about the top angle, the bottom angle, or the big angle. So if we want to name angle 3, there are only 3 ways to do it. You can call it angle 3, we can call it angle D, G, F, or we can call it, E, or we could call it angle E, G, D. Those are the only 3 acceptable ways to name angle 3. You cannot call any angle in this figure angle G. Next, I want to review with you your 4 types of angles. First is an acute angle, which is greater than 0 and less than 90. And a right angle is 90 degrees, an obtuse angle is greater than 90 and less than 180, and a straight angle equals 180. In this class, we will not talk about 0 angles, and we will not talk about any angles that are greater than 180. You will talk about those angles in later math classes, however. Next, I want to talk about congruent angles. Congruent angles are 2 angles that have the same measure. So since angle A and angle B are both 27 degrees, we could say angle A is congruent to angle B. Or we can also say measure of angle A equals the measure of angle B. Alright? Congruent angles are angles that are equal in measure. Either of these statements are interchangeable in this math class. However, do not tell me angle A equals angle B, and do not tell me the measure of angle A is congruent to the measure of angle B. Either of these bottom 2 statements would be incorrect. Remember, angles are congruent, their measures are equal, and don't mix those 2 things up. Next is one of the most important concepts in this class, the angle addition postulate. And I am going to claim that if you do not understand the angle addition postulate, you will not get an A in this class. That's how important it is, and that's how often it comes up. The angle addition postulate states that if point B is on the interior of angle AOC, then the measure of angle AOB plus the measure of angle BOC equals the measure of angle AOC. In other words, if you have 2 adjacent angles, the 2 small angles have to add up to the big angle. That's half of the angle addition postulate. The other half of the angle addition postulate is the one that most students forget. It is that if you have a straight angle, the 2 angles have to add up to 180 degrees. Next, we need to talk about different types of angle pairs. Our first type of angle pair are vertical angles. Vertical angles are 2 angles whose sides form opposite rays, or as I like to say, 2 angles that are across from one another when 2 lines intersect. Angles 1 and 2 are vertical angles. Angles 3 and 4 are also vertical angles, but vertical angles has nothing to do with up and down. Our next type of angle pairs are adjacent angles. Adjacent angles are 2 coplanar angles with a common side, a common vertex, and no interior points in common. Angles 1 and 2 are adjacent angles, and angles 3 and 4 are adjacent angles. However, you would not say angle ADB and angle ADC are adjacent angles because they do share interior points, such as point E right here would be on the interior of both angles. So those would not be adjacent angles. They do have a common vertex D, and they do have a common side, ray DA. However, since they overlap, they're not adjacent angles. Our next type of angle pairs are complementary angles. Complementary angles are two angles whose measure equal 90, such as angles 1 and 2. We know they add up to 90 because of the right angle symbol, and angles A and B add up to 90 because one's 40 and one's 50. However, angles C, D, and E, even though they add up to 90, would not be considered complementary angles because complementary angles are two angles that add up to 90 degrees. So B and E would also be complementary angles because that's two angles that add up to 90. Last is supplementary angles. Supplementary angles are two angles who add up to 180 degrees. So angles 5 and 6 would be supplementary, and angles M and N would also be supplementary because there are two angles that add up to 90 degrees. This concludes lesson 1-6.